December 17, 1986, 2:47 a.m. A roadside rest area on the New Jersey Turnpike near Dumont. Two state police detectives approach a parked Oldsmobile. Inside sits Richard Kuklinski, 51 years old, 6 feet 5 inches, 300 pounds. As detectives draw their weapons, Kuklinski looks up and smiles. "Took you long enough," he says. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. They arrest him for conspiracy to commit murder. But Richard Kuklinski isn't just facing one charge. Over the next 18 months, investigators will connect him to 38 separate homicides spanning 3 decades. His neighbors in Dumont knew him as Big Rich, the successful currency trader who threw barbecues and drove his kids to school. What they didn't know was that the friendly man operating the Mister Softee ice cream truck in their neighborhood had murdered at least 38 people, including some who lived on their street. After killing a target, Richard would return home for family dinner. The next day, he'd drive his ice cream truck through the same neighborhoods, serving cones to children whose fathers he may have just murdered. For 30 years, nobody suspected. His wife thought he worked in finance. His children thought he was a legitimate businessman. The parents buying ice cream for their kids had no idea they were handing money to a contract killer. This isn't a story about a psychopath losing control. This is a story about compartmentalization so complete that a man could strangle someone at 3 p.m., then help his daughter with homework at 6 p.m. This is the story of how New Jersey organized crime families created the perfect murder system by outsourcing death to one man who existed outside their structure, and how that man convinced everyone around him he was normal while running the most efficient contract killing operation in American Mafia history. Here's what most documentaries get wrong about Richard Kuklinski. They focus on psychology, the childhood abuse, the sadism, the freezing method that earned him the nickname the Iceman. All true, but it misses the structural reality. Richard Kuklinski wasn't a serial killer. Serial killers murder for psychological gratification. They have patterns, victim preferences, rituals. Kuklinski had none of that. He killed whoever paid him to kill, using whatever method the job required. Shooting, strangling, poisoning, stabbing, blunt force trauma, he didn't care. He wasn't fulfilling a compulsion. He was running a business. And that business existed because organized crime families in New Jersey and New York faced a fundamental problem. When a MAID member kills someone, it creates exposure. There are witnesses, relationships, motives that connect the killer to the victim. But when you hire an outsider with no ties to the victim, someone who doesn't brag, someone who doesn't exist in mob social circles, the murder becomes invisible. That's what Kuklinski provided for 3 decades. Invisible murder. But here's the part that makes this story different from every other hitman profile. Kuklinski didn't just compartmentalize his criminal life from his family life. He integrated them. The ice cream truck wasn't just cover, it was psychological camouflage. It allowed him to exist in neighborhoods as a friendly presence, while simultaneously reminding himself that he controlled life and death. He could kill a father on Monday, and on Tuesday sell that man's son a chocolate cone. And nobody would ever know. This is how the Mafia's contract killing system actually worked. How it was built, how it operated for 30 years, and how it finally collapsed. Richard Leonard Kuklinski was born April 11, 1935, in Jersey City, New Jersey. His father, Stanley Kuklinski, was a Polish immigrant railroad brakeman. His mother, Anna McNally, was Irish-American, working in a meat processing plant. They had 4 children. Richard was the second oldest. Stanley was an alcoholic who beat his children. Not discipline, beatings. Richard later testified his father would come home drunk and beat him and his siblings with fists, belts, broom handles. Anna didn't intervene. She participated. Richard described his mother as meaner than his father. In 1940, when Richard was 5, his older brother Florian died. The official cause was listed as falling downstairs. Richard later claimed his father beat Florian to death. Stanley and Anna told the other children never to speak about Florian again. The family pretended he'd never existed. This matters not because it excuses what Richard became, but because it explains the mechanism. Richard learned early that violence was normal, that death could be hidden, that families lie, and that survival required disconnection from emotion. By age 13, Richard had killed his first human being. The victim was Charlie Lane, a local bully. According to Kuklinski's later testimony, Lane beat him up in front of other kids. Richard went home, got a wooden dowel rod, found Lane walking alone, and beat him to death. He was 13 years old. He never told anyone. Lane's body was found in an alley. Police assumed it was gang-related. They never connected it to Richard. That pattern, kill and stay silent, would define the next 40 years. By age 18, Richard was 6 feet 2 inches, over 250 pounds, physically imposing. He worked odd jobs loading trucks, warehouse work, collections for small-time loan sharks. He wasn't part of any organized crew. He was freelance muscle. Someone needed a person hurt, they'd hire Richard. He'd hurt them, get paid, ask no questions. Between 1955 and 1960, Richard killed at least 5 more people. None were contracted hits. They were personal. Men who'd insulted him, fought him, owed him money. Richard's threshold for violence was 0. If you created a problem, Richard solved it with murder. But these weren't mafia murders. Richard wasn't connected to organized crime yet. He was just a large, violent man in Jersey City who killed people and got away with it. That changed in 1962 when someone introduced him to Roy DeMeo. Roy DeMeo was a rising earner in the Gambino crime family, running a crew out of Brooklyn that specialized in car theft, drug distribution, and murder. By the early 1960s, DeMeo's operation was earning hundreds of thousands annually. But he had a problem. Bodies create exposure. Police investigate known associates. Informants talk. DeMeo needed someone outside the organization. Someone who could kill without connection. By 1962, Richard was doing freelance enforcement for DeMeo's crew. Collections, beatings, intimidation. Richard would show up, hurt someone, leave. He didn't ask questions. He didn't gossip. He didn't drink with the crew afterward. DeMeo noticed this. So in 1963, he tested Richard with his first contract. The target was a low-level drug dealer who'd shorted DeMeo on payment. DeMeo gave Richard a name, an address, and $5,000. Richard found the man in a Newark parking lot. He walked up, shot him twice in the head with a .38 revolver, walked back to his car, drove home. The whole sequence took less than 3 minutes. He called DeMeo from a payphone. Job done. DeMeo was impressed. Not because Richard killed someone, lots of guys could kill, but because Richard showed 0 emotional reaction. No bragging, no guilt, no excitement. He'd done a job. He wanted his money. Richard Kuklinski became a contract killer. Here's how the system worked. DeMeo, and later other Gambino and DeCavalcante family members, would contact Richard when they needed someone killed. They used intermediaries. A guy would approach Richard at a diner or truck stop, say a name, sometimes an address, sometimes just a description. Payment was negotiated, usually between $5,000 and $40,000 depending on the target's profile. Richard never asked why. He didn't want to know. Motive created connection. Connection created evidence. Richard's value was his complete disconnection from the victim. Once Richard accepted a job, he'd research the target. Follow them. Learn their patterns, where they worked, ate, parked. Richard would sometimes follow a target for weeks before making a move. He wasn't impulsive. He was methodical. The method varied by client requirements. His primary techniques were shooting, quick, efficient. Richard preferred .22 caliber pistols with suppressors. The small caliber bullet would enter the skull but not exit, bouncing inside the brain. One shot, instant death, minimal blood. Strangulation, slower but silent. Richard used rope, wire, or his hands. He'd approach from behind, loop the ligature around the neck, pull until the victim stopped moving. No ballistic evidence. Poisoning. Richard claimed to use cyanide on multiple occasions, putting it in food or drinks, or spraying it in someone's face. Cyanide works in seconds. Coroners in the 1960s and 70s didn't routinely test for it unless they had reason to suspect poisoning. And then there was the method that gave him his nickname. Freezing. Richard would kill someone, store the body in a commercial freezer for months, then dump it. The delayed decomposition made it impossible for medical examiners to determine accurate time of death. This created alibis. If police thought someone died in July, but Richard had actually killed them in March, witnesses who saw Richard in March became irrelevant. He used a freezer in a meat storage warehouse in North Bergen. The owner believed Richard was storing game meat from hunting trips. Between 1963 and 1986, Richard killed at least 38 people this way. That's the confirmed number. Richard himself claimed over 100. Law enforcement believes the real number is between 50 and 70. By 1970, Richard was earning between $50,000 and $200,000 annually from contract killing. That's equivalent to $300,000 to $500,000 in today's money. That's how he afforded the house in Dumont, the cars, the family vacations. But the money wasn't the primary motivation. Richard later admitted in interviews he would have killed for free. He enjoyed it. Not emotionally, but professionally. He enjoyed being good at his job. In 1961, Richard met Barbara Pedrusai at a bowling alley in North Arlington, New Jersey. Barbara was 18. Richard was 26. He was charming, funny, well-dressed. He told Barbara he worked in currency exchange. She believed him. They married in 1962. By 1963, they had their first daughter, Merrick. They moved to a small house in West New York, New Jersey. Richard worked. Barbara stayed home. To everyone who knew them, they were a normal working-class family. But Richard's work was murder. He'd leave the house in the morning. Barbara assumed he was meeting clients, trading currency. What Richard was actually doing was stalking targets, negotiating contracts, killing people. In 1964, Richard bought a Mister Softee ice cream truck. This wasn't traditional cover. Richard actually operated the truck. He'd drive through Bergen County neighborhoods playing the jingle, selling ice cream to children. He made maybe $100 to $200 weekly in summer. Enough to look legitimate. But the ice cream truck served another purpose. It allowed Richard to move through residential neighborhoods without suspicion. If someone saw Richard's truck parked on a street, they assumed he was selling ice cream, not surveilling a target. And the psychological aspect mattered. Richard later admitted he enjoyed the contrast. He'd kill someone in the morning, then spend the afternoon selling ice cream to children. It reinforced his sense of control. He could switch between identities seamlessly. Killer, father, ice cream man, all the same person. Barbara never suspected. She later testified Richard was a good father in many ways. He attended school events, helped with homework, took the family on vacations. But he was also violent. If Barbara questioned him, he'd hit her. If the children misbehaved, he'd beat them. Not constantly, but enough that everyone understood Richard was in control. In 1969, the family moved to Dumont, New Jersey, a quiet suburb in Bergen County. They bought a house on Sunset Street. 3 bedrooms, a yard, a garage. Richard told neighbors he worked in finance. Nobody questioned it. Richard drove nice cars, paid his bills, his kids were well-dressed. To the outside world, Richard Kuklinski was a successful businessman. Meanwhile, he was killing 2 to 3 people yearly. The compartmentalization was complete. Richard would execute someone in the afternoon, dispose of the body, then drive home for dinner at 6. He'd sit with his wife and 3 children, Merrick, Kristen, and Dwayne, eating pot roast, discussing homework and school projects. Then he'd watch television until bed. Barbara Kuklinski later testified about this period. She said Richard seemed like 2 different people, sometimes calm and attentive. Other times he'd explode, throw things, punch walls, hit her if she said the wrong thing. But Barbara attributed this to work stress. She still believed Richard worked in currency trading. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The children later testified they were afraid of their father. Not constantly, but enough that they learned to avoid him when he was in a bad mood. Richard never told them what he actually did. They didn't find out until his arrest in 1986. Let's examine specific murders to understand how Richard operated. Louis Mosquet was a 51-year-old pharmacist from 40 Fort, Pennsylvania, running a small-scale drug distribution operation. In July 1981, Mosquet contacted someone in New Jersey about buying bulk cocaine. That someone was connected to Roy DeMayo's crew. DeMayo saw an opportunity. Instead of selling Mosquet cocaine, DeMayo decided to rob him. But Mosquet would report the robbery, so DeMayo hired Richard to kill him. Richard set up a meeting with Mosquet at a rest stop on Route 287. Mosquet arrived with $95,000 in cash, expecting to buy cocaine. Richard shot him in the head, took the money, drove Mosquet's body to the freezer warehouse in North Bergen. Richard kept Mosquet's body frozen for over 2 years. In September 1983, Richard dumped the body in Rockland County, New York. The freezing had preserved enough tissue that the medical examiner noted inconsistencies in decomposition patterns but couldn't determine exact time of death. Police investigated Maskey's 1981 disappearance but never connected it to the 1983 body. Richard made $50,000 from that job. $40,000 from DeMeo, plus $10,000 he kept from Maskey's cash before giving the rest to DeMeo. DeMeo knew Richard skimmed. He didn't care. The job was done. Robert Pronge was another contract killer who also operated a Mister Softee truck and used the freezing method. Some sources suggest Richard learned the freezing technique from Pronge. But Pronge made a critical mistake. He started talking, bragging about murders he'd committed. Word reached Roy DeMeo. DeMeo told Richard to eliminate Pronge. Richard later claimed he killed Pronge with cyanide, putting it in his hamburger at a diner in North Bergen. Pronge ate the burger, started convulsing, collapsed. By the time paramedics arrived, Pronge was dead. The death was ruled a heart attack. Pronge was 49 years old. The medical examiner never tested for cyanide. After Pronge died, Richard took over some of his ice cream routes, including neighborhoods in Cliffside Park and Fort Lee. Richard would drive the Mister Softee truck through those streets, serving ice cream to children. Some of those children had fathers Richard had killed. There's no evidence Richard specifically targeted victims' children. He didn't seek them out, but the statistical probability is unavoidable. Richard killed dozens of men in Bergen County over 3 decades. Many had families living in neighborhoods where Richard operated his ice cream truck. Gary Smith was a low-level criminal who'd stolen from Roy DeMeo. DeMeo wanted Smith killed in a way that sent a message, so Richard didn't hide the body. Richard lured Smith to a motel room in North Bergen. Once inside, Richard beat him to death with a tire iron, then dismembered the body using a chainsaw he'd brought in a duffel bag. He put the body parts in garbage bags and dumped them in dumpsters across northern New Jersey. The body parts were found over a week. Different locations, different jurisdictions. Police in Fort Lee found the torso. Police in North Bergen found an arm. Police in Hackensack found the legs. By the time they connected the pieces and identified Gary Smith, the trail was cold. Richard later testified that dismemberment was messy and he didn't like doing it, but the job required it, so he did it. This pattern repeats across all Richard's contract killings. No ritual, no signature, no personal connection, just identification, execution, disposal, payment. Here's what people miss when studying Richard Kuklinski. They focus on his psychology, his childhood, his capacity for violence. But that doesn't explain how he operated for 30 years without getting caught. The answer is structural. Richard existed outside the traditional Mafia hierarchy. He wasn't a made member. He wasn't even a formal associate. He was a contractor, and that created insulation. When a made member kills someone, the murder connects to the family. Witnesses can identify the killer. Informants can testify. RICO statutes can connect the murder to the organization. But when a family hires an outsider with no formal ties, the connection breaks. Roy DeMeo used Richard specifically for this reason. DeMeo ran a prolific murder operation out of the Gemini Lounge in Brooklyn. His crew killed over 100 people between 1973 and 1983. But most murders were done by crew members. When law enforcement investigated DeMeo, they could connect murders through witnesses, patterns, relationships. But Richard's murders? No pattern. No witnesses who knew him. No connection to victims. Richard was a ghost. And the Mafia protected that invisibility. They didn't introduce Richard to other criminals. They didn't bring him to social events or let him hang around social clubs. Richard would get a call, meet someone at a neutral location, get job details, do the job, collect payment, then disappear back into his suburban life. The DeCavalcante family used the same system. When they needed someone killed, they'd contact Richard through an intermediary, usually a low-level associate with no connection to the target. That associate would meet Richard, relay contract details, arrange payment, then disappear from the process. This created layers of deniability. If Richard got caught, he couldn't give up the boss because he'd never met the boss. He couldn't identify the intermediary because the intermediary used a fake name. The whole system was designed to be compartmentalized, and it worked for 3 decades. But there was a weakness: Richard's ego. By the early 1980s, Richard had gotten away with dozens of murders. He was confident, and confidence breeds mistakes. In 1980, Roy DeMeo was murdered by his own crew. The Gambino family leadership decided DeMeo attracted too much law enforcement attention. With DeMeo gone, Richard lost his primary client. Work volume decreased to 1 or 2 contracts yearly instead of 3 or 4. That meant less income. Richard had expenses: the Dumont house, 3 kids, Barbara's spending, cars. Richard needed money, so he started taking riskier jobs from people he didn't know well, jobs not vetted through usual channels. Law enforcement had been investigating Richard since 1981. They didn't know the full extent of his crimes, but knew he was connected to multiple unsolved murders. The problem was evidence. They had suspicions, informant tips, but no proof. So they created proof. They sent an undercover agent, Dominic Polifrone. In 1982, a man approached Richard saying he represented a network of criminals needing enforcement work. That man was Dominic Polifrone, an undercover agent with the New Jersey Attorney General's Organized Crime Task Force. Polifrone spent 4 years building a relationship with Richard. They'd meet at diners, truck stops, bars. Polifrone would mention jobs needing done, people needing hurt or killed. Richard would discuss methods, prices, logistics. Polifrone was wearing a wire. Every conversation was recorded. Richard didn't suspect anything. He'd operated freely so long he'd stopped being cautious. He talked openly about murders he'd committed, described methods, even offered to kill someone for Polifrone to prove his capabilities. In December 1986, Polifrone told Richard he needed someone killed. Richard agreed. They negotiated $50,000. They set up a meeting to finalize details. That meeting was December 17, 1986, at the New Jersey Turnpike rest area. When detectives arrested Richard, he didn't resist. He smiled. "Took you long enough." Richard Kuklinski was charged with 5 murders: Gary Smith, Daniel Deppner, Louis Mosquet, Paul Hoffman, and George Malaband. Prosecutors had evidence connecting him to these 5 through Polifrone's recordings, witness testimony, and forensic evidence. During interrogation, Richard confessed to over 100 murders. He described methods in clinical detail, showing no emotion. When asked if he felt anything killing people, Richard said, "I didn't think about it. I had a job. I did the job." The trial began in 1988. Barbara testified about their marriage, the violence, her ignorance of Richard's true work. The children testified about their fear of their father. Dominic Polifrone played the recordings. Richard was convicted on March 5, 1988, of murdering Gary Smith, Daniel Deppner, and Louis Mosquet. He received 2 consecutive life sentences plus 30 years. Here's what Richard Kuklinski's story reveals about organized crime. It's not about honor or loyalty or family. It's about usefulness. The Mafia will protect you as long as protection serves their interests. But the second your death becomes more advantageous than your life, you're done. No negotiation. No second chances. Richard understood this. He provided a service, invisible murder, that organized crime families needed. As long as he was useful and silent, they protected him through institutional insulation. They kept him separate from their operations, used intermediaries, created deniability layers. But Richard wasn't protected because the Mafia cared about him. He was protected because his protection served their interests. The moment Richard became a liability, through his own ego and carelessness, that protection evaporated. This is the pattern across all contract killing operations. The killer exists outside the organization. The organization maintains distance. When the killer gets caught, the organization claims ignorance. The system protects itself by sacrificing individuals. Richard Kuklinski wasn't special. He was just efficient. He killed without hesitation, without emotion, without leaving evidence. He maintained a normal suburban life that provided legitimacy cover. And he stayed silent for 30 years. That silence was his value. The moment he started talking to Dominic Polifrone, he destroyed that value. And once the value was gone, Richard was just another criminal facing prosecution. Richard Kuklinski died in prison on March 5, 2006, from heart disease. He was 70 years old. He'd served 18 years of his sentence. Barbara Kuklinski divorced him in 1993. She later wrote a book claiming she never knew about Richard's murders. The children testified they suspected something was wrong, but never imagined the full scope. The man who sold ice cream to neighborhood children while murdering their fathers spent his final years in Trenton State Prison, claiming he felt nothing about the murders. "It was just business," Richard said in his final interview. "I had a job. I did the job. That's all." And that's the truth behind the contract killing system. It's not about psychology or pathology. It's about economics. Richard Kuklinski murdered 38 confirmed people because organized crime families paid him to murder 38 people. The system created the killer. The killer served the system. And when the system no longer needed him, it let him fall. That's not a tragedy. That's the Mafia working exactly as designed. If this deep dive into the real story behind one of America's most prolific contract killers revealed something you didn't know, hit that subscribe button. We drop untold Mafia stories every single week, stories that go beyond the headlines into the cold, structural reality of organized crime. Drop a comment below. What part of Richard Kuklinski's double life is most disturbing to you? The murders themselves? The suburban father facade? Or the system that enabled him for 30 years? Let us know, because at Mafia Talks, we don't just retell the legends. We uncover what really happened and why.